Political Studies, JNU. So on behalf of JNU Academic, I would like to extend my warm welcome to so you guys joined us for today's panel discussion on the topic Jürgen, Habermas and the fragmentation of public sphere. So before proceeding ahead, let me say a few words about JNU Academic. JNU Academic is a student-led forum that seeks to create spaces for critical dialogue and meaningful academic engagement within the university. We aim to bring together diverse perspectives and encourage open discussion on important questions of social and political relevance. JNU Academic is an independent initiative and we rely on voluntary contributions to organize such discussions. A QR code will be circulated among all of you. Please contribute any amount you are comfortable with. Your support will help us continue organizing more such conversations. Moving on, we are privileged to have with us an esteemed panel of speakers today. First, Professor Gurpreet Mahajan, former professor at the Center for Political Studies, JNU. Her work focuses on multiculturalism, minority rights and secularism. Her contributions have been central to debates on democracy and diversity in India. Among her notable works are India, Political Ideas and the Making of Democratic Discourse, Accommodating Diversity, Ideas and Institutional Practices, and the Multicultural Path, Issues of Diversity and Discrimination in Democracy. Second, we have with us Professor P.K. Dutta, former professor at the Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory, JNU. His work lies at the intersection of modern Indian political thought, intellectual history, and identity formation in colonial and post-colonial India. He has contributed significantly to debates on nationalism, communalism, and the making of political identities in South Asia. His works include Heterogeneities, Identity Formation in Modern India, Carving Blocks, Communal Ideology in Early 20th Century Bengal, and he is also one of the co-authors of Khaki Shorts and Saffron Flags, a critique of the Hindu right. He is also a co-editor of volumes such as Modern Indian Political Thought, which has been widely used in teaching and research. Third, we have Dr. Amir Ali, who will be joining us shortly. He is an assistant professor at the Center for Political Studies, JNU, whose research focuses on political theory, multiculturalism, group rights, and global politics. Among his major publications, his books include Brexit and Liberal Democracy, Populism, Sovereignty, and the Nation State, South Asian Islam and British Multiculturalism. In addition, his contributions also include edited volumes on the Sachar Committee report and multiculturalism in India. So before we begin, I would like to briefly outline the format of today's session. So each speaker will share their remarks for around 20 to 25 minutes. They will have 5 minutes each to respond if they wish to, following which we will open the floor for a Q&A session. And with this, I invite the speakers to begin with the discussion.
And first, I must apologize for being late, and I cannot offer any excuses. The fault is entirely mine. So, very sorry for that. And particularly to Professor P.K. Dutta for keeping him also waiting. Unpardonable, but having said that, I thought before we begin thinking about the public sphere, I want to go back to what he read from Nancy Fraser. The fact that he stayed with her as he did with many people who lived through the 70s and 80s and 90s. And we find that he continues to be an important presence at that time. So the question really I thought one should address, because we are talking about him at a time shortly after his passing away. And he was one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century. So perhaps you should begin to think in terms of how do we really assess and talk about the work of somebody who has been such an important influence in the lives of so many people and so many theorists who have influenced perhaps and whom you have read or who have influenced you. We have several theories about how to read a text, how to recover meaning, whether it is contextualizing it and so on and so forth. but we don't often have any way of thinking about how do we assess or how do we talk about the contribution or significance of a person, of a political philosopher, particularly one who is our contemporary or who has lived during the same period of time as one has lived. We don't often have this problem when we are dealing with the people who have lived distant from us. Because what happens is that in such cases, we look at not only their writings, but also the positions they took on various social, political, economic and other issues. And that seems to weigh heavily on, sometimes even on their ideas and so on and so forth. And as I said, this is the dilemma we confront when we are dealing with people whose lifespan, writing span overlap with our own. Thinking time, reading time, and so on and so forth. I want actually to say that even though it is important and necessary to think in terms of the totality of a person and to think in terms of the positions they took, I want to move away from that perspective or way of looking at Habermas at this time. More so because I think we look at a person and what the positions they took, and we often will be very disappointed. I think that's the usual fate. We get disappointed because we have expectations, but they are expectations of a person who tends eventually to think that I could have followed, I could have been with the writings of somebody, but they have disappointed me. But if we were to step away and not look at Habermas from the perspective of somebody who I could follow, so not as a follower, but as somebody whose writings I can still read because of the questions he asked, or remember because of the questions he was asking, which were similar to the questions we were ourselves grappling with in a very different society, for the kinds of ways in which he tried to answer those questions. So we may have disagreements, I may be completely dissatisfied with the response he gave to the question, but it is nevertheless something which is worth thinking about, reading about, reflecting on. I say this even more strongly because Habermas's major concern was Europe and the dilemmas before Europe. He wasn't thinking about post-colonial societies, he wasn't thinking about India. And yet there was something, I think, in his writing which resonated. And I want to begin with that and to say what is it that made Habermas such a towering figure at that time. Not in, he's already located within Frankfurt School, though despite all the restrictions, he was an heir to the Frankfurt School and was its member and one of its leading theorists for a long period of time. So it's not within circles of Marxism that Habermas was read, but outside of it, even outside of it. And I want to think of why that was the case and what is it that he's thinking about, which we might also want to think about today. In the 60s and more so in the 70s, the dominant issue really was how do we think about and assess theory of historical materialism. This is something you may not necessarily be thinking about, but in the 70s, there were already many questions about historical materialism and with it Marxism. A dominant perspective which was emerging at that time was to say that all theories emerge in a particular context. So they are a perspective from a certain standpoint, thereby questioning its validity or its, Habermas used the word truth, the truth of that theory for people who had lived or for a period of capitalism or of modern world which is beyond the time in which it was written. So there was already this question, what is the status of historical materialism in Marxism? And this question was being asked both within the Marxist circles as well as outside of it. Does it have any kind of relevance in societies, in contemporary societies? And I think the other question which was related to it was about enlightenment and the project of enlightenment. Even today, you'll find there's a huge body of literature which is questioning the legacy of enlightenment, or often blaming enlightenment for the present condition. Because enlightenment was associated with capitalism and therefore with imperialism, colonialism, etc., etc. So should enlightenment be, and its rationality, issues, values it brought or put into the public domain, be rejected summarily? Should we also forget about and set aside historical materialism? This is one set of questions that Habermas engaged with, and I think those questions in some redefined form continue to stay with us and are extremely significant, and that's one of the reasons we need to think about him and what he said. There was this Habermas kind of occupied a space which was within Marxism and yet outside of it. This is something that has come up in what he said. And this is so because he will hold on to the idea and value of historical materialism and its truth content, while simultaneously saying that it is, as we are looking at it, insufficient and inadequate for understanding contemporary world and society. So he adds one new dimension to it, because if historical materialism gives primacy to political economy, relationships around mode of production, and sees that as the axis through which we should understand society, politics, economy, he is suggesting that that's an important concern, but it's not enough. And the major innovation that he will make in the theory of historical materialism is to add a theory of social organization. And he will put this as a separate domain. So you must look at, when you are studying the modern world, you are looking at your own society, study the critique of political economy and exchange relationships that comes from a certain branch of Marxist theory, but supplement it with the fact that in society we have to also think in terms of what is the mode of social organization and principles of social organization. This kinship or family, language, custom, tradition, habit. This is the dimension he will introduce into Marxist thinking and regard this to be extremely significant. So he will bring in the study of language, communication, social interaction. And this has many significant consequences or implications for the way we think about and understand society, our own society, because it would suggest that you cannot think in terms of, you remember this base superstructure model that used to be talked about, one-to-one relationship. So he's displacing that and suggesting that the relationship is more complicated. Some aspects of our lives may be governed by market and exchange principles, but others may be governed, social interaction may be governed, let's say in India, by feudal principles. So you will have, as it were, contradictory tendencies. So if you are looking at Indian democracy, for instance, from the Habermasian perspective, what you will need to think is that you have the possibility of states speaking this dual language. In the economic sphere, it may be anchoring itself and thinking about certain principles which are market-based, which are thinking about the dominant capitalist mode of production and accumulation of capital and so on and so forth. But when it comes to interaction with the larger masses, so let's say electoral politics, you will find the language of political discourse is very different. It is using a language, so people talk about as patron-client relationship. They used to say, my baap sarkar. All those things actually was, Habermas wasn't talking about India, but I'm just saying if you read somebody like that, and he's saying that this is it, that there is a dissonance between principles of social organization and the principles of economic organization. So you don't necessarily have a coherence. Everything doesn't fit in very well. And you will find these contradictory tendencies being part and parcel of democracies in the contemporary time. And to some extent only, this is a new kind of legitimation crisis that the state will face. There is a legitimation crisis in terms of, it was traditionally talked about that once democracy comes, the expectation is that people will vote for their interest, not for the interest of a small dominant group which controls the means of production. They will vote for their own interest, but that doesn't happen. So understand these kinds of relationships as to why this doesn't happen, the whole ideology here, or the fact that you can be using a certain language of appeal which connects on the basis of principles that are dominant. The pace at which the society is changing is very different from the pace at which, and the principles with which economy is coming. So you will have this dissonance, and this will create all kinds of possibilities. And you can see whether people acknowledged Habermas or not, this became an important way of thinking about Indian democracy, predicting results, looking at why. People don't use market principles when they're doing exit polls and so on. They're using really social categories most of the time in order to understand people's political behavior. Almost as if the economic aspects were not influencing it. So I think these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind before we come to the public sphere, which I hope people will talk much more about. The second thing is the rejection of enlightenment in its entirety, and with it, of course, reason. Is reason a source of liberation, emancipation, critique? This is something that he will think about a little bit. And he changes his position on this. But the important thing for us is, we don't have time at this moment to talk about the changes and shifts in his position. But keep in mind that he is against all those. This is the time also of post-modernity. So critiques of modernity are coming up. Against all that, he holds on and wants to rehabilitate the Enlightenment project. The centrality it gave to the individual, to autonomy, to freedom, to equality as it was defined within the Enlightenment project. And he wants to hold on to it and say the challenge really is, and that's the challenge we were talking about in the public sphere, the challenge is that there is, reason has been, the Enlightenment project for him had been in some sense, we say derailed or diverted, because reason has been rationalized. Reason has taken the form of, in brief, instrumental rationality. So this is what is dominating in every sphere. So if it is instrumental rationality, therefore we have lost the emancipatory potential of reason. But that is not to say that reason is something that we need to abandon, and it has no possibility of showing us a path towards emancipation. But how will it do that? And eventually the idea that he will introduce comes much later in his writings, which he refers to as communicative theory, but before that as universal pragmatics. That is what he will say, an ideal speech situation. So how are we going to really revitalize democracy? What are we going to do? And we need to do something about it, not only because, and that's the connecting element, instrumental rationality is governing all spheres of our lives, including social relationships. So there is not, it is not kinship and loyalty that is dominant there, it is instrumentality, how useful you are for me, and how might I possibly also think in terms of ways of reaching and approaching you through ways which are instrumental. So this entire transaction in the political realm is based on instrumental rationality. We need to change that. The other big challenge is, which is one part, very substantial part of his idea of public sphere, is that today our life world is colonized. The space for democracy has shrunk because of power and money. It is interventions literally of money and power which has led to this kind of, we just use his word for shorthand reference, life world into system world. It has created a framework within which it is no longer possible to use the available space of the public sphere in order to think in terms of challenging instrumental rationality, creating a more emancipatory ethic. So one aspect of it obviously is to find ways of challenging and fighting for spaces so that this area of the public sphere is not dominated and completely controlled by money, by capital, or by political power, economic power, or social power, power more generally. But the other thing is, and this is what is most important for him, at least later in his writings, that we need to think in terms of activating democracy and democratic spaces by revitalizing what he will call communicative ethic, communicative rationality in the public sphere. Think of a time when we are thinking of bringing, democracy. There is electoral democracy, so there is a way of writing which will say we need to think in terms of greater participation of the people. So it could be through movements, but in the 80s, the force is with what they call civil society, non-governmental organizations, various formations within civil society, and that is supposed to be the means by which we will activate the space for democracy. And Habermas moves away from that thinking, not because he thinks those are not important categories, but he thinks eventually what we need is the space to set debate and set norms. I might even say policies, but set norms through a dialogue. And there are certain conditions of debate that have to take place, so that it's not like, supposing we take the example of debates that go on in television in the 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, 20, whatever you want to call it, for a long period of time. You have different people, they come, say their piece, their own set position, and they shout and scream a bit, and they leave, because they have conveyed to you their position. And he wanted that the public sphere cannot work, it cannot have an emancipatory potential if this is the form of exchange of ideas, views, points of views, etc. What we need is people having the possibility and the space to ask questions of whoever is speaking, the speakers willing to listen and change their position, so that at the end of it, everyone has in a way moved from their original position. If everyone's going to stick to just their position and saying this is my view, choose this or that, then you are not in a position to understand the emancipatory potential of reason. The emancipatory potential will come only if this communicative rationality is activated. So it's a sphere. He referred to it as an ideal speech situation, which you can see ideal may not exist very easily in reality, but this is what is needed. Sincerity of the speaker, capacity of everybody to be able to participate and ask questions, your willingness to address questions, listen to the other person, change your position. And we will arrive at, now you can see how he rehabilitates the idea of reason. Rationally motivated consensus should emerge at the end. That is the only way in which emancipatory dimension of democracy, of the Enlightenment project can be actually retrieved in the present world. Do the social sciences have a role in this? I think I have run out of time, so I should just say for him, he's amongst the early people to recognize how significant and important that is. And just two simple ideas I would flag here. One is that for a long time, even perhaps certainly when I was a student, and maybe when you are a student and thinking in terms of social sciences, you are taught natural sciences are dealing with natural objects which exist independently of other, and social sciences are we are dealing with society which we have created and the rules of which we have created, etc. And he shifts the discussion and he says what differs is the knowledge interest. So we have to think what is the dominant knowledge interest that particular disciplines are or a framework is serving. If it is of control, I'll just give one aspect. If it is of control, then he will put it alongside what are called the natural sciences. If the interest is interaction, then you are on the side much more of humanities and the social sciences of a certain kind. And the challenge is to move beyond merely understanding meaning and interaction, and then to set it up as a discussion, as a dialogue and so on, and recognize the critical and emancipatory potential. So you need to release that emancipatory potential. And he thought, and this is the dream that many political theorists have from the time of Plato onwards, that maybe the university will be the place. In Plato's time, they didn't have universities, but in our contemporary world, he thought that universities could be such a space where you will have a more active public sphere, which is able to engage in this. And I'll just stop here.
Raheel, thank you, Gurpreet. Thank you, Raheel. And JNU Academic, it's quite wonderful to actually have independent kind of autonomous initiative by students. In some ways, it's an exemplification of the public sphere at a micro level. So really, in the way, it's quite appropriate. I've entitled my presentation today as, "So what can we get out of Habermas?" question. A question rises naturally from the title of the meeting today, the fragmentation question. The academic questioning of the public sphere began from the last century of the publication of Habermas's 1962 classic, translated in 1989 as a structural transformation of the public sphere. For Habermas, the public sphere was produced in the historical conditions of 18th century Europe by the exchange of private bourgeois individuals who socialized in the worlds of coffee houses and salons, engaged in literary discussions and so on, discussions that took place on matters of shared interest. These conversations generated a notion of the common good. Its practices corresponded to its universal preoccupation by its open access. In principle, anyone could enter into the exchange. Further, the public sphere could hold any other sphere of activity to account, including the state. I will begin by recalling some of the criticisms that have been made. These bear out the truth of the title of the seminar today in two ways. The studies demonstrate that the public sphere was at its point of origin itself fragmented. Secondly, that it was limited and not quite democratic and egalitarian. The question I pose after this short survey, which follows, is a why and a what. Why does the conception of the public sphere still seem so productive today? And what can we gather from its intriguing nature? I will conclude my presentation with what I call the ethics of solidarity. Summarizing the existing literature, even in 1998, the late Jeff Elley summarized at least 4 kinds of criticisms of the public sphere. All of these underline its exclusionary character while asserting the contestatory nature of publics. Besides the growth of the plebeian sphere that Habermas himself acknowledges in the 1991 preface, the most influential criticism came from feminists like Joan Landes and Nancy Fraser. The former, especially, stressed on the projection of ascetic, manly qualities of the new Republican public in France, in 18th century France, that marginalized the position of the salons. Indeed, there seems to have been an intensification of the unfreedom of women in 18th century France. The imprint of this critique has been extended in the post-colony, in Partha Chatterjee's work, which has, in a number of articles, sought to underline the elitist underpinnings of the colonial and post-colonial public sphere. Chatterjee argues that the conception of the public generated in 19th century Bengal, a culture of appropriate behavior, was proposed that was derived from the Western world. It was a project, as it were, of the westernized elite to produce a politics as pedagogy. social life and politics as pedagogy. This defined the elite westernized world of the Bengali bourgeoisie, which thereby distinguished itself from the rest of the population. He has also raised another problem, that of the incommensurability of arguments and claims that are made between rational, civic-spirited sections and those of the popular sphere that includes religiously led groups. Such confrontations, it seems, can only be resolved through pragmatic negotiations or violence, not certainly through the public exchange of reasons. While these criticisms have justly paid attention to the fragmentation of the public sphere, it can also be claimed that they are witness to the multiplication of the public sphere itself. Tanika Sarkar, for instance, has shown how the elite sphere of the Bengali Bhadralok that consisted of both orthodox and reformist trends met in newspaper exchanges in 19th century Bengal to generate a new normative conception of womanhood that possessed rights like entitlements. The public sphere, it may be argued, was not just derivative, but also generated real social effects that laid the grounds for further expansion of itself to autonomous women's publics. We may also look at the generation of a powerful low-caste public sphere from the 19th century, among other developments that have happened in the 20th century and beyond. The multiplicity of public spheres demonstrate two tendencies. The first is an internal trajectory of universalization of different individual claims and micro-communities into general categories such as Dalit or women/gender. But at the same time, this is also an act of fragmentation, for these spheres tend to limit the boundaries of their public to specific publics with their particular experiences and rationalities. It is this dual trajectory towards universalization or generalization and boundedness that I will keep in mind while I turn to the productivity of the notion of the public sphere in facing the challenges of our times. Habermas himself identified, and this is, of course, I'm selecting the challenge. There are multiple challenges that have already been kind of laid out, and of course, of capitalism and the changes in the structures of capitalism. But the one that I want to kind of zero in was the challenge of the present phase of our modernity in the rise of religious discourse. Characterizing our period as post-secular, Habermas sought to extend his notion of public reason. I will address the specifics of his recommendations later, but here I wish to point out a major problem in his characterization. Public sphere, the basic notion, is challenged not just by religious belief that rehearses the age-old secular religious debate, but a hybrid phenomenon that draws on both religious belief and nationalism to produce a political program. The characteristic ground of this is not belief, but quote-unquote sentiment, an affect that is appealed to as the non-transgressible and ever-expanding authority not amenable to reason or to alternative affects. In other words, what we have as the challenge of our times is the absolute social authority of identitarianism. This frames the world of politics as based on the logic of war, demanding not just suppression of enemies, but the authoritarian consolidation of its own social world that is required in conditions of perpetual war. While I have in mind the Hindu right as an instance, identitarian projects in other conditions can take on the mode of other quote-unquote religious nomenclatures such as Christian or Islamic, or indeed of specific ethnicities. Indeed, even the left and liberal can assume the lineaments of identitarianism itself. The challenge is posed when identities acquire political power that transform its mobilization from being dissenters and resistors to repressors of rival dissenters and minorities of different hues. It is in the context of this challenge that I will try to improvise on Habermas's work to think about the need to use many of the elements of the post-secularist public sphere to generate what I call an ethic of solidarity. I'm playing here on Habermas's notion of the ethic of citizenship, which he deploys as the grounds for dialogue between believers and secularists in that essay that I referred to on religion. Also, I should clarify, I am locating the ethic of solidarity in relationship to organized political parties that are resistant to ruling hegemonic political and social dispensations. Hence, I am not deploying all the elements that Habermas stipulates in his essay on the post-secular, including the determining power of the constitutional state. I can go into that a little later, but for him that's the most important, the liberal constitutional state. Instead, I selectively use some of the elements of conversation that Habermas advances in this essay, which I think extends the idea in the structural transformation of the public use of reason. I deploy some of these elements to frame the ethic of solidarity as the grounds for conversation between all the splintered groups that face the challenge of a unitary, overweening authority, which also mobilizes considerable public support for identitarian domination. The ethic of solidarity, it seems to me, is an urgent and necessary ground for producing a united social front for democracy. I will outline here as a preliminary exercise 2 conditions for this possibility. The first concerns the conditions for conversation. As a preface, let me say that solidarity needs to acquire roots deeper than coordination of political parties and groups, or participation in demonstrations, or indeed the temporary calibration of strategies before all of these collapse in the fact of practical needs, in the face of practical needs. The ethic of solidarity needs to be posited on ongoing conversations. In his article, which I had referred to earlier and which I'm using a lot, that is The Religion in the Public Sphere, published 2006, Habermas offers us some hints about these conditions. The most important requirement is that of translation. Grounded in the commitment to solidarity, individuals and parties need to extract some shared ideals or values on the basis of which they can make sense to the other. This requires that the other too makes a corresponding effort. This is not an easy task. On the one hand, translation requires a commitment to universalizing one's claims and values so that it can make sense to the other. I talked about the generalizing trajectory earlier within the particularities of specific publics. This trajectory needs to be extended, and it may have to do so in order to critically examine the limits of particularism that each political commitment requires. Further, translation also involves that which is untranslatable. Each public has its own experience of deprivation and privilege, and there are emotions and histories attached to these that may not be translatable at all. There can also be religious beliefs that can approach varieties of mystical capacities which may resist translation. This kind of condition requires respect. But respect itself is not a commitment not simply a commitment to symmetrical treatment of the other with the self. That is, both you and the other treat each other with respect, which is symmetrical. It requires more. It involves empathy for the social conditions of the other, which is never symmetrical. Socially, we are never symmetrical. It has to address questions of inequality and social asymmetry. And empathy here needs an attempt to emotionally grapple with the difficulties as well as the limits of understanding the experiences and emotions of the other. All of this is a tall order and certainly not something that one can demand from the constantly stormy watchfulness of organized political actors per se. This brings me to my second point. The ethic of solidarity cannot be actualized in debates and discussions in formal political institutions run by political parties. The dialogues that I have outlined above need to be conducted in the informality of social institutions where debate need not result in the reaffirmation of boundaries, much less so, as Gurpreet just pointed out, much less so in their dramatization as happened in the popular televisual debates of today. This is a level of sociability that involves political actors, both organized and informal, but which operates below the level of organized politics. Above all, it is in these places of sociability that can lower political defenses against each other and allow for the openness of a public sphere, one which is conducive to dialogue. Further, the informality does not restrict purely conversations do not restrict conversations which are purely related to politics per se, but can extend to a range of expressive areas, including personal relationships and the values that underpin these. But all these will be dialogues that may exchange reasons, but are not confined to purely rational deliberation. So reason has to be extended. There has to be different modalities of reason and different registers of quote-unquote dialogue, which is more than the category of reason. It is institutions that can range from chai shops to screen talk, which can produce the groundwork for a solidarity that can exceed the exigencies of political alliances. Indeed, they can provide the rubric where alliances can settle, stabilize, without parties and groups losing their sense of distinctiveness. In other words, what I propose is a culture of solidarity on which political groups can nourish their own democratic credentials without surrendering their political differences, even as they take on the challenge of authoritarian domination. Let me, in conclusion, reiterate the point that I am riffing off Habermas. This is not an introduction in some senses to Habermas. I'm trying to be a little wayward with Habermas. The public sphere of structural transformation is, of course, normative, but it also draws on historical sociology. This may lead to the conclusion that the normativity of the public sphere is simply confined to its historical juncture. However, what needs to be taken into account is also the context of the publication, and we've been told how the whole thing of structural transformation actually talks about the breakdown of the public sphere itself, and plebiscitary, acclamatory kind of refeudalization of the public sphere that takes place, which is controlled, as it were, and systematized. However, as I'm saying, what needs to be taken into account is also the context of the publication in 1962. For Habermas, the normative status of the public sphere was meant to counter, as Rahil pointed out, the conservatism of the Adenauer regime and its constriction of debate over the preceding fascist era. In other words, the public sphere was normative as a political praxis, as an act of dissent and transformation. Hence, it was not necessarily confined to its historical moment, even as it is grounded in 18th century Europe. This allows us to make a more flexible deployment of the public sphere for our times and the diversity of our social context. Thank you.
Academic for inviting me. My apologies for being so late. Never underestimate the Delhi traffic. There's also a dust storm in CB. I don't know if there was because JJ was affected. But anyway, those are my excuses. Okay, I'm going to begin with. This is the second talk on Habermas that I've given. There was a talk that I gave in the Center for German Studies where I was very, very harsh on Habermas, and I intend to continue to be harsh on Habermas. But I got an intriguing email from Habermas, from the dead. So I'll begin with that very short email that I got after I gave that first talk. This is from Jürgen Habermas. I can communicate with the dead, as you can see. So it goes like this. Dear Amir, I really love your unermüdlicher Geist, which means unflagging spirit. You do need to realize that I am now what we Germans call Eintoter, which means dead. The discussion would have been, referring to the talk that I gave 2 weeks ago, the discussion would have gained more if there had been plausible discussions on how the public sphere, as a productive idea, had been applied to the Indian historicist concept. Now there's a sentence in German which I can't read out, and it advises me to talk a bit about Sandria Freitag, who I did engage with in my earlier work on the public sphere, the Indian public sphere. It goes on to say that you should leave my dead, fading legacy alone. Then it's a postscript. This is about me. It says, you talk too fast. The tempo is that of an Aston Martin on an Autobahn. Try being a Volkswagen. Now, I must say, I like the idea of an Aston Martin because James Bond would drive an Aston Martin. Shaken, not stirred. Okay, that apart. I'm going to begin on a contentious note because, we don't come to bury Habermas or praise him. That's a line from Shakespeare. We don't come to bury.
Is often interred.
With the bad lives on after. That's precisely what the good is often interred with the Mark Antony speech in Julius Caesar. The bad lives on after, and that's the point that I want to make.
Evil.
The evil lives on after. I'm going to begin with Nancy Fraser's obituary. My apologies. I had a written script. It is in my office. I couldn't access my office because I came straight from CP to here.
He just read Nancy Fraser's on the page.
Oh, so I don't need to do that. But when I'm speaking with you, I'm extra careful because I'm still scared of this.
Yes, I
She taught you.
Yes, my supervisor. You can imagine my predicament.
So he's going to run on the Autobahn.
Of course, I won't read out, but I will pick out that point of Fraser's obituary. She says that she learned so much from Habermas. And yet there was the light flickering out, and the light finally flickered out on Habermas, because that was tragic. If there was one public intellectual who consistently engaged with the issues of his time, it was Jürgen Habermas. And the fact that he remained silent, not just remained silent, but actually ended up supporting Israeli actions in Gaza is, I think, to my mind, a shame. I am completely disappointed by the stance of many Western intellectuals. It shows a certain kind of a myopia towards this part of the world. I still can't understand why that happens. Of course, this is to do with something called German Staatsräson, a certain kind of a reason of state, whereby the continued existence of Israel is something central to Germany because of the historical experience. But I do want to make one point, something very strange about Germans, that they do get their genocides wrong. The Nazi Holocaust, of course, the Nama and Herero genocide of 1905, Southwest Africa, and of course, the most recent one, the ongoing Gaza genocide. And I think that for an intellectual of Habermas' stature, to not just get it completely wrong, but to end up supporting a genocidal regime for the purpose of German Staatsräson is quite tragic. It's a travesty also. So as I said, I do want to begin with that point. Asif Bayat, the I think Egyptian sociologist, did write a rejoinder to this. This all happened in November 2023. This is a month after the beginning of the Gaza genocide. In the way that I want to structure today's talk, if it is structured at all, because I'm completely out of source, I want to focus on two moments of Habermas' engagement in the public sphere. The first is the 1960s, 1968 specifically, and then the second is the more recent student encampments that have happened across the world. Now, the point that I want to make is that on both these counts, Habermas was perhaps on the wrong side of history. So in 1968, his response to German students, he was supportive of them. There's no doubt about the fact that he was supportive of them. But he did end up calling student actions as a form of leftist fascism, which I think is unfortunate. The other thing that struck me was that there's a certain kind of a caution, a kind of excessive sobriety in the way that students, I mean, Habermas by that time would have been in his 40s or perhaps in his 50s. So there's a certain kind of an excessive caution as a university academic that he is kind of trying to tell students. He almost ends up telling them, he uses the term actionism. And he says that student activism for the sake of activism is just wrong. Now, he may have a point there, but the particular manner in which he's castigating German students for their particular activism on campus, to my mind, is a little unfortunate and indicates how he went wrong on the more recent student campus that happened over the Gaza issue. So there's a great deal of flack that he does get from students in terms of what he refers to as actionism. To be absolutely honest with you, I mean, I was reading the Spectre intellectual biography that you had sent me. And in the way that the term actionism is used, it almost reminded me of Mr. Modi's under and GV charge against people. I mean, you think of the way that actionism is hurled at students. The idea that there are some people who just live for a certain kind of activism and there's a certain kind of no end to that activism inside, that it's activism for activism's sake. And I think that the seeds for his more recent completely going wrong lie in this particular attitude. Now, as I said a little while ago, the thing that has always drawn me towards Habermas, what I found very attractive about him, is the fact that, of course, he's writing hefty tomes like Theory of Human Action, 1981, which is such a challenge to read, it must have been a challenge to write as well, or a book like Philosophical Discourse on Modernity or Between Facts and Norms. But this kind of abstruse theorizing does not prevent him from wading into the most complex political issues of his time, and that is to his credit. And he remains a very engaged kind of a thinker. So there are three moments of this engagement or wading into the public. So the thing about a university academic leaving his university campus to enter the most contentious debates of their times is actually a bit like a duck out of water. You see ducks out of water, particularly unelegant to look at. But he did it. And I always commend university academics because there come certain moments when the campus must be able to respond to the very, very difficult and contentious times that are happening in wider society. And again, as I said, Habermas to his credit did it. But I'm going to focus on three moments, perhaps four moments, of this particular activism in the public sphere. One I just flagged, 1968. This is in response to the Shah of Iran's visit in 1967. Unfortunately, one student was killed. I forget the student's name. If I had the script in front of me, I would have been able to remember. But one student is killed, and it's precisely the killing of the student that seems to have created a certain kind of a caution, a certain kind of somewhere. Certain theorists and their caution have been characterized as caution's excess. This is the term that Ernest Barker referred to when he was talking about Plato's communism. He referred to as caution's excess. And I think it's that kind of caution's excess that one finds when you see Habermas talking about student politics and where he thinks it's going wrong. So that's one moment where, and as I said a little while ago, I think this does set the kind of tenor and tonality for the more recent completely going wrong. Then come the debates of the 1980s. This is the kind of flaring up of the Cold War before the Cold War finally ends in 1989. And Habermas is, again to his credit, very, very actively responding to the stationing of Pershing and cruise missiles on German soil. This is around the year 1983, and this is the time when the SPD government of Helmut Schmidt has just been voted out of power, and the Christian Democratic government of the other Helmut Kohl, comes to power. There are too many Helmuts in Germany. So Helmut Kohl's government comes to power. Now, what I notice, and again, I'm expressing my admiration for Habermas here, is the consistency with which he is opposing this particular attitude in Germany, the kind of movement towards a greater securitization. The fact that he understands that there's a certain kind of, and he terms it neoconservative movement to the right in German politics. And again, as I keep saying, to his credit, he is responding to this in the way that a good, engaged academic should be responding to it. So this is the early 1980s. That's the second moment that I want to flag. The third moment that I want to flag is around, again, the mid to late the early to mid 80s, where he is engaging with a set of conservative German historians, again whose names I forget, but they seem to be relativizing the Holocaust, suggesting that it wasn't as bad as it is made out to be, and one of the ways in which this relativization of the Holocaust is happening is in terms of comparing it to the horrors of the gulags in Stalinist Russia, Soviet Union in those days. Now, on these three counts, I do notice a certain kind of a consistency, a certain kind of an honesty with which Habermas is bringing his theoretical exertions to bear on the actual politics. And for me, this actually is what a lot of politics is all about. There is a certain element of the pulsating in the political. I mean, one thing that I always has attracted me to JNU as a student, as a faculty member, is how active, how lively is the politics. And I always call this a certain kind of a pulsating aspect of politics. Now, one of the reasons why we have such an active student culture, you pointed this out towards the end when I just came, that universities become a very important space in terms of this. Now, this element of politics which pulsates with life actually happens through the activism of students. It is the pulsating presence of students that gives that very, very vital lifeblood of activity to the university. Without that, the university is a dead entity, and as I see, universities, the tragedy of universities in this country is that they slowly, gradually die out. JNU is dying a very fast death. It's being kept up by you guys, faculty members like me, hard barely contribute to it. But this is the point that I'm trying to make here. My point here is that it is this particular manner of Habermas is suggesting to the students that they're going too far, that they need to exercise some degree of caution, that is trying to stifle that particular activism of the promise of that activism. So on that first count, I'm trying to suggest that he's getting it wrong. He's perhaps not able to understand that the university lives for its students, and in fact, without the students, the university would not be an entity that is alive. The reason why I keep making this point is, I mean, faculty members are regular features of university life for 25 to 30 years of the time that they serve their tenure. But when it comes to students, they're there for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, in case of JNU, if you add a PhD, 9 years back. All right? And it is that, I hesitate to use the word evanescent, but that fleeting presence of students. And it is precisely that fleeting presence of students that really gives the university its energy, its vitality, its vigor, that Habermas is kind of trying to attenuate or mitigate or bring down. I'm still trying to understand why he would do this. One reason is that he's what is called a 50-acre, someone who comes to intellectual maturity not in 1968, but in 1958. He carries memories of the Nazi regime. So there's a certain kind of a paranoia that he almost has in the back of his mind. It goes back to this point of the 1949 German Constitution, that somehow the state has to be protected at all costs, otherwise it would lead to some kind of anarchy. So perhaps that would explain what I refer to as cautious excess in Habermas. But let me come back to the 80s point, the point about the Persian and cruise missiles, where I think Habermas was impeccable in terms of the way that he stood up against this kind of NATO expansionism and this kind of imperialism and the stance towards the Soviet Union and the communist bloc in those days. On the Holocaust relativization, again, I would suggest that Habermas is almost impeccable in the way that he's trying to say that you cannot in any way mitigate or attenuate or lessen the horrors that Nazi Germany was responsible for in terms of the fact that 6 million Jews were killed. So on all of these counts, I'm suggesting that he comes out pretty much in flying colors. Again, in '89, he seems to start his activism and his academics seems to start coming adrift for the simple reason that in his mind, German unification is just too hard. And he seems to be criticizing Helmut Kohl and the fact that he's just too, he's rushing into it. He doesn't use the word a bull in a china shop, but every time I read Habermas and whatever he wrote around that particular time, this is the sense that I get, that he's saying that, okay, let's exercise caution, let's not do this too quickly. Let us resort to a particular provision in the German Constitution, I think it's Article 146, which says that unification must follow a referendum or a plebiscite. But that doesn't happen. It just happens with the German Democratic Republic, GDR, almost kind of acceding to the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, which is West Germany. And here he is trying to exercise a certain kind of a caution again. And this is where I think it starts going wrong for Habermas. Again, in the Spectre biography, which I had a good time reading it. I'm so grateful that you sent it to me because I was reading it this morning. It almost suggests that in the 80s, Habermas is on the offensive. So when he's taking that position on cruise and Persian missiles, he's on the offensive. He's taking positions that are proactively against this. Again, on the relativization of the Holocaust, he's taking an active position. But then all of a sudden, when it comes to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany that happens next year, in 1990, he seems to be strangely defensive. And I think it is this continuing of this defensive posture that explains the very, very unfortunate way in which Habermas was not really able to stand up to what I consider the biggest moral issue of our times, which is the question of Gaza. I mean, for a social theorist of Habermas' nature, to get that so completely wrong, to my mind, is a complete travesty. Now, I will honor that email and quickly talk about the manner in which the idea of the Habermasian public sphere was adapted to in social history, especially through the work of the historian Sandra Freitag, whose work I read a long time ago. It's been almost 20 years now. My gosh, 20 years just flies by like that. The thing that struck me was that, you mentioned this point, that how do I put this? The sanitization of the public sphere, the fact that it is characterized by a particular kind of a rationality, is contrasted so much with the Indian public sphere and its chaos. I mean, Freitag makes this point that one of the best ways to understand the public sphere in India is the Akhara, the modern Akhara, the kind of the chaos of the wrestler of the Akhara. Now, that gives you an immediate sense of, on the one hand, Habermas's overly sanitized public sphere, and the sanitization is done through this particular focus on reason and the entry into the public sphere of reason of public discourse. And on the other hand, you have this particular idea. Now, what that tells me, and again I'm going to try to think of the public sphere of the last 3 decades, is not just a fragmentation, as the title of this panel discussion suggests. But in India, we have witnessed pretty much a smashing of the public sphere into smithereens. Now, this happens with the kind of communalization that we have witnessed in this country, and especially post-Babri Masjid, which is now 34 years ago. Also the fact that our public sphere is one of the most, it's characterized by a certain kind of a noise. I refer to the work of Rajagopal, who looked at television and the serialization of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata series, that really lent this very raucous character to the public sphere, which we are now witnessing, the worst effects of which we are now witnessing. So it is precisely the rationality of the Habermasian public sphere, contrasted to the much more raucous nature of the Indian public sphere, which tends to suggest to me that there's really not much that we can do with this particular, not just fragmented, but completely smashed into smithereens public sphere that we have in terms of the experience of this country in the last 30, 40 years. I will come to my last point, and again, forgive me for the very fragmentary nature of my presentation. And this is to do with constitutional patriotism, which of course is the major contribution that Habermas makes in terms of, after the theory of political action, the late 80s, around 87, 88, is increasingly talking about constitutional patriotism. Now, this is where I think the transposition of this idea from a German-European context into India is much, much more fortuitous and fortunate compared to the transposition of the Habermasian public sphere to the Indian public sphere that I just talked about. So just let me quickly reiterate this point. What I'm trying to end on, the note that I'm trying to end on, is that the transposition of the Habermasian public sphere is a slightly unfortunate kind of a transposition. However, the other major Habermasian concept, which is the idea of constitutional patriotism, is to my mind a much, much more fortuitous and fortunate transposition, and I'll explain the reasons why I think so. When I think of the way that Habermas talks about constitutional patriotism in the context of Europe and Germany, there's a certain kind of excessive sobriety that I find in this, a sobriety that does not fire the imagination. Now, I did make this point in the earlier presentation, I'm going to make this point again, that when I think of sobriety, it can become or lapse into a vice if it is not sufficiently fired by an imagination, a kind of a political imagination. There is a certain kind of a dry as dust, bone dry quality to the Habermasian notion of constitutional patriotism. And my point is that when it was transposed into India in the most dramatic form, in the way that the women of Shahin Bagh tried to engender the public sphere by coming out into a public domain that was crafted on that road between Shahin Bagh and Sarita Vihar, a part of the city that I'm very familiar with, that I visited many, many times, I could see the way in which the way that we were talking about constitutional patriotism in this country was given flesh, bones, and spirit in a way that Habermasian understanding of constitutional patriotism could not give it. I mean, never in my life did I think that when I would listen to a kind of a public reading of the preamble of the Indian Constitution, it would give me goosebumps. It did give me goosebumps, and so many people were there. So that's my point. My point about a theorist like Habermas is that he can be full of surprises and disappointments. There are a series of disappointments, and to my mind, the biggest disappointment was on this particular issue. You know, in my career in the social, you will know this, Professor Mahajan, I've had a series of obsessions. You know, there was a Rushdie affair at one time, and my friends started making fun of me, saying, you're always talking about one thing all the time. And I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think that given the very bad state of the 21st century right now, one of the biggest issues that characterizes the rottenness of this is the fact of the Gaza issue. The fact that in German universities, in many American universities, in many Western universities, students who on principle grounds stood up and condemned and criticized Israeli actions were beaten into submission. I mean, I was reading about the University of California at Los Angeles, and the way in which the police, the campus police, suppressed these protests reminded me of 5th of January 2020 ANU. So that is the unfortunate part, but again, as I said, given the capacious nature of Habermas, the fact that he is a theorist of such plentiful intellectual resources, it is on the issue of constitutional patriotism. Because when I read about it for the first time in the late 1990s, I thought, oh, this is a pretty boring kind of an idea. There's nothing which fires the imagination. There's no inspiration behind this idea. But then, you know, in the way that the Shinebaum protests were able to give constitutional patriotism a certain kind of a life, a certain kind of a breathing spirit, I thought, oh, Habermas, well, a theorist like Habermas cannot die actually. I'll end on a kind note, you know, but perhaps this is one lever that he gives us, which is more fortunate than the other lever of silence and support for Israel, which to my mind is still something I cannot get my head around. Okay, I'll just stop.
Sphere and the fragmentation of the public sphere. But my question is that the public sphere, the way it is imagined in the space, is it rational enough? I mean, the space itself is very sub-rational and full of emotions. So, given that situation, given that understanding, and when we understand it in India, so we see the political space is full of emotions. The way on the social media, and social media obviously proliferates it, and even the way that these big platforms, Facebook and Twitter, they make profit out of it. So they utilizes this emotion to even to engage people into some kind of a debate and discussion. I mean, that is the real nature of in which we try to understand the Habermasian topics. So my question is that is it really, or is it something which we try to think which is not even possible, that there has to be some kind of a rational sphere, because it is not rational. So are we thinking of something which cannot be possible?
Just take some and then we can all go.
So my question is based on my recent observation in the campus. Since Habermas hails from Frankfurt, so we see the Hindu right, and particularly RSS in the campus. I mean, it has recently launched a probe against, in the name of cultural Marxism, which has its roots in Hitler's Nazi Germany and anti-Semitism. So I observe a contradiction here, because on one end you find the Hindu right supporting Israel and its genocide, and you have Modi calling Israel as fatherland at one end. On the other end, you have the same Hindu right which is attacking scholars from people like Habermas and Adorno and people from scholars from the same school, which has roots in Nazi Germany. So I'm just trying to make some of this contradiction. Like, why Hindu right which supports Israel is actually using the anti-Semitic tool to attack attack the left and the left on the liberal and the same thing in the name of cultural Marxism. This is my first question. my second question is to Professor Amir Ali. Exactly he mentioned about Shaheen Bagh protest and the constitutional patriotism that he invoked. As a person from Tamil Nadu and as Tamils who constantly see Hindi as a language in the public sphere, I wonder whether non-Hindi speakers in this country will actually feel the same constitutional patriotism. Because I come from Tamil Nadu where 1960 when anti-Hindi negotiation debates, the protest happened, they actually burned the constitution. So how exactly the constitutional patriotism will work when for the non-Hindi people in this country, India represents Hindi majoritarianism.
This is what the Tamil question. Yeah, I completely get it. The public sphere is always inflected by a particular dominant Hindi-speaking Indo-Gangetic region. Right? But this is the point. Recently, Stalin, Chief Minister, made this point about India being a union of states, and he invoked the constitution, and he had the government on the back foot in terms of the kind of federalism that you see. So the thing is that an idea like constitutional patriotism provides one with a very strategic and tactical response to the kind of nationalism that we see. So on the one hand, you have the kind of frenzy of flag-waving patriotism, which is the forte of the Hindu right. On the other hand, you have the kind of sobriety of constitutional patriotism. And in the world that we are in right now, where this country is right now, I think that the Tamil Nadu Chief Minister's particular invocation of the constitution as a union state was very, very intelligent. And I'm suggesting that there is a particular kind of a tactical response that one requires to outflank the kind of nationalism that we see. It's a very frenzy kind of flank. And it can only go on for so much time. It can't last forever. Now, in terms of taking the momentum out of it, what better political and intellectual resource can one have than this one? Now, I completely get your point about the wording of the constitution back in the 60s. I completely get that point. But let me make one more point about Tamil Nadu, because I think Tamil Nadu is actually the most resistant state to me. Right? It's not Bengal, it's not Andhra, it's not Kerala, it's not Karnataka, it is Tamil Nadu. Now, one reason for this is the emphasis on reason, that the whole question of rationality and the self-respect. And there you have a very Habermas inflection to that. So then I take the first point of what you said. But at the same time, I would suggest that there is a particular tactical maneuver that an ideal like constitutional patriotism gives us in the kind of situation that we are to wriggle us out of this. I hope that answers the question.
To approach the question slightly differently. When I'm looking at Habermas as a political thinker or a theorist, I'm thinking that he's suggesting, or at least that's what I'm going to take from him, because otherwise life is full of disappointments, and I don't see why I should pin so much hope on any one person or what they actually say. He's suggesting a normative ideal which has a possibility of connecting with us in our present time. So we could look at the public sphere in its descriptive form, what actually exists here and the form it takes at a given moment, and that form changes, and you may have simultaneously many different expressions and spaces within the public sphere. But think of it as a normative ideal, something that we need to hold on to, of the kind that he had, which has communicative rationality. That is why then you will begin to say why it is so important to have spaces which are not entirely controlled by corporates, by money, by influence and power of various kinds. So I would think of the public sphere as one such normative ideal in reality. If you look at what exists at any moment in time, it will have all these things, some of which I think he has just flagged about the fact that Sela Ben-Habib, Sandra Freitag, you mentioned Nancy Fraser, all of that Sela Ben-Habib was this feminist idea that you are thinking in terms of a public sphere which is dominated by an ethic which is not accommodative of women and so on. So there I think, and he concedes that pluralization, you said multiplication, I think rather than fragmentation, think in terms of pluralization of the public sphere that has taken place and is there. Now if there is pluralization, how are we going to move towards a space space where you actually are able to talk, express, and exchange point of view, and perhaps arrive at some kind of agreement sooner or later. He's referred to it as ethic of solidarity and what are the conditions for it to exist. And I think what conditions are necessary, I'm going to just add on one from Habermas, some of which you have elaborated, but I think the one which is important is this normative ideal that should be there, that we need to hold on to. Also the realization that, and you hinted at it, that we need to, because there will be particular public spaces and public spheres, not spaces, there will be particular public spheres, whether it is gender or some social identity based or language based or whatever. What is the possibility? Is it necessary to even imagine the possibility of going beyond the particular or finding a conversation between the particular that can lead towards the universal? I think Habermas asking me to say, well, that's an ideal I want to hold on to, let me see how this can be explored, something that he was doing in actual reality, what can be done. It is true, and one of the sort of strongest criticisms of Habermas have been about the idea of reason, and in our own country people will say emotions play such an important role, and those who exclude emotions are not able to connect with the people. I think we need to recognize he's talking about reason, he's talking about arguments that are being given, which are given reasonings, not a completely detached, abstract reasoning. So if you are offering reasonings for various things, those reasonings could be located and could draw on resources, both of experience, of history, of culture, of time, of shared icons, and so on and so forth. I think we need to move beyond this kind of dichotomy to say either that this is being excluded. I think there is space within that. It's something that is a shared project with him and somebody else, many other people, like say Charles Taylor for one. So I will just leave it at that to say that there are many other things. I think constitutional patriotism as an ideal is significant and important. It has always been seen as being very dry, not just constitutional patriotism, but the Republican tradition which thinks of it. But its intent is to ask ourselves, is the only way in which we connect with each other will be on specifics of cultural identity or social identity. Can we think either of a space for conversation or of a world which is alluding to this and allowing others to allude to similar kinds of histories and experiences and coming together? So how to redefine nationalism without necessarily having to abandon it? So I thought that those are the interesting elements that I think I would like to think about when it comes to art.
Thanks, articulated already. Just to elaborate this thing about emotions, I think it's a real major challenge. What you have, and if you look at the kind of consumption of emotions and the dramatization of emotions, which then feed into the consumption. So there is a kind of circularity that's constantly going on. And how to then reckon with emotions. I think one thing I don't know, I mean, it's something that's been bothering me a lot, like all of us, is whether we take emotions as a unitary phenomenon. You know, emotions are also linked to particular contexts, to particular values, and hence also to certain rationalities, to certain reasons for either extending those emotions. It could be passion, the political passion that he's talking of, which I found actually, in a sense, when I was thinking of Jamia and my visits there, that you have the passion, but it is a kind of controlled passion that allows for a public sphere to be produced on the streets. You know, because it's not that they are, you know, jumping up at Modi or any. It's a very, very controlled kind of thing where people are coming, speaking, there are cheers, the people are talking, people are listening. You know, so it's a kind of a different kind of public sphere that is being produced contextually, in the kind of idea of constitution, which again, as you very rightly pointed out, is a kind of completely, it's a text which is very boring in a certain sense for any normal person. And yet it becomes an emotional thing. So emotions have to be also seen in terms of its relationship to its objects, to its values, and so on and so forth. Whereas emotions that are there, which are constantly being generated and produced in the social media, often by often by the right wing, are emotions that are actually seeking to manipulate you. Now, this is of course easy to say. How the more difficult thing is to produce a counter public of emotions, which would think of values and not leave out emotions, but to produce a more fuller dialogue, in a sense. And that is the challenge I think Habermas leaves us with, because it's not in that sense something, it is a normal kind of problem of the reason versus emotion sort of thing that has happened in, say, literary discussions and so on and so forth, and which we find in ourselves. But it's always a differential conjunction of the two, which is important, and the values that push these forward. Reason can be terrible as rationalization, as a kind of history of rationalization. So, maybe that may also, to some extent, address this question of constitutional patriotism and the importance then of the constitution, but also the importance of producing, and it seems to me that becomes even more important now, when the constitution is a question mark. When the existence of the because constitutions can be many kinds. We'll always have a constitution. What we're thinking about is the present constitution, which is more or less in a liberal framework. And how is the passion attached to that constitution, or to even extend some of the provisions of that constitution towards a more democratic kind of governance structure, rather than to an authoritarian one. And therefore constitution then becomes a very, very emotional and important issue, both rational and emotional. So that's what I would concur with.
For example, when he came out with this thing, I think he was actually part of the Illegal Debate or something. It created quite a controversy. But my point is that Grass had a much greater, more prescient understanding of where the world was heading. So I reminded him in 2016 when he gave one of the last interviews he gave before his death. I think the Spanish newspaper El País. And the newspaper asked him, what do you think about the prospects of the world? And he said, we're marching or sleepwalking toward World 3. He got it spot on. Unfortunately, Habermas didn't seem to have this particular sensibility, and that's what
I read an article once which kind of also addressed this question of the, as it were, the mushrooming of the genocide industry in Germany.
Right.
And part of it also, there was of course the reaction against these historians who are revisionist historians of the genocide and all of that. But on the other flip side, there was also this argument that sensitivity to genocide, to the genocide conducted in Germany, became a sign, a precious sign of German identity, by which they would then differentiate themselves from the Turks or from the other minorities. And of course the Jews are very safely outside of Germany also, so it makes it easier as well. But it was an interesting article which I thought made a very important point, and that may also be that the reason why you fixate on one genocide, this will never happen again, and makes it into a particular genocide without thinking of other genocides, without universalizing question of genocide.
Important discursive device of self-exoneration as well.
Yeah, but also of positive identity.
So a sense of deep responsibility. There's
Sure.
a huge German guilt associated with it, what you're referring to in the German phrase. So there is that element. And as I said, eventually it's not necessarily the political positions, though we may be interested in that. I don't think of this question. We are living in a world where it is almost impossible are located in a particular, whether it is identity or a state or a situation, who are thinking in terms of being shaped by that and responding to that. And the big question for us, which is the only relevant thing I read from Habermas, is that going to really create, you might think of solidarity as narrow group solidarity, but that's not the solidarity you're thinking about. So the question really is, how do we think in terms of purely academic work, methodological work, political work, as moving beyond the idea that there is something so unique and particular here which is completely non-translatable or completely cannot be understood or is going to be systematically only misunderstood by others. How do we create a sensibility of trying to overcome that, to build, find ways in which we have an effort to translate? Maybe it will need something called respect to refer to, I agree with that. There could be other elements that are there to talk about now, whether it's some degree of self-doubt that is so necessary rather than certitude that we are right. That's an addition in which you listen. But somewhere there is this thing that perhaps we should recognize that these silos we have created in which we are going to be bound and then therefore going to be arguing past each other or building emotions for or against. This is something that we need to find ways of overcoming. And I think that's something we wanted to hold on to and perhaps pass it on to new people who read it, that that's a project which is worth holding on to and thinking about, even in our present predicament as it was written.
We'll take a couple more questions and we'll call it a day.
It takes up Dr. Ali's surprise that why would anyone who had been a politically engaged intellectual to, take such positions. Now, from where I'm coming, his academic mover of speaking about a historically contingent development of a certain kind of public sphere in 18th century Europe, and his other, evocations such as Europe is the center of the world and everything else that happens everywhere else is not a very important concern. So when we are talking about his idea of public sphere, he's mostly talking about a European public sphere. Now, he himself says that Europe is the center of the world and nothing else matters to that extent. So the problem that I'm finding with his knowledge and his politics is not very opposing each other, because there's a contingent nature in which he historicizes public sphere developing in a certain way. Plus, this is the problem with intermixing academic knowledge and politics of positionality, where a decolonial thinker puts it very succinctly. He calls it a point zero perspective. How a contingent situated standpoint turns out to become universal knowledge, and we end up engaging with it as if it is a universal capturing of reality. So it is not at all surprising. My question to you is, and to all of you, is the idea of public sphere is delimited in his totality, in his scheme of totality. So when we are reading, as some of one of the questionnaires asked, is the idea of public sphere to be much more irrational, much more chaotic, much more argumentative in Amar Singh's notion of Indian public sphere. So when we are looking at that, why are we not also looking at the larger political, economic apparatus which promotes a thinker located in Europe to a global intellectual stature, where, and that stature is elevated only through the political economy of colonialism and the neo-colonial and the coloniality that we are discussing. So the whole decolonial approach, looks at it very critically. And some sitting in Delhi studying, it's a post-colonial view of it. It makes a lot of sense in that way. So that point zero perspective tells us how his politics and his academic interventions are not entirely in opposition to each other. So how would you respond, Dr. Ali and anyone else, if you would like to? Thank you.
Okay, one last question.
Hello everyone, I am Vikas, a student of Master Center for Political Studies. So my question is to Professor Mahajan, when he was discussing that Habermas within Marxism and also outside of the Marxism, and responding to the debate of the 1970s debate of the historical materialism and critique of political economy. So I have been in this context in India, we have in the social domain feudalism and all these kind of democracy में एक तरीके से understand करने के लिए बेहतर करते हैं. So I have been reminded of when Marx talk about primitive accumulation, and he discusses about how feudal institutions and human slavery has been also used for the primitive capital accumulations. And in India we can also see that कि जो bulldozer मतलब एक तरीके से जो bulldozer justice and communalism, all these phenomena we can see is a social phenomena, but actually what ideology does is to its camera obscura, तो हम लोगों के मतलब reality को उल्टा कर देता है. What is political economy is lying behind it, कि एक तरीके से जो surplus labor create करने का. So how Habermas मतलब वो social इन सब सारे phenomena को understand करने के लिए he will use communicative theory and social space, public space, all these things. How Habermas in this context is within Marxism and outside of the Marxism.
It's a difficult problem that you're posing about contingent knowledge and universalism. It's been constantly kind of a debate, and it's a debate that also I've also wrestled with in different ways. But I think part of the problem that we have today in India, not just as post-colony but inserted today in India, is that we are too fragmented into too many disparate groups when there is a large challenge that is facing us. That's number one, of authoritarianism. Now, the relationship between that and colonialism is something that needs to be thought through. Specifically in terms of Habermas, I think one of the problems is that whatever has come as a generation, as a grounds of what is identified as the colonial, is somehow completely inaccessible to us because it is Greek colonial. That therefore Habermas's idea of Europe and his later understanding of Europe and so on, and of Gaza, is therefore in some ways flows from his ideas of the public sphere. I think it's giving too much authority to the author. I think there needs to be a decentering of the author principle here, because as you would have seen, even in say a critic like Partha Chatterjee, he is actually citing Tagore. And what you're seeing is another history that is unfolding. And there have been Samuel Freitag talking of processions and public performances, but also public debates by Tanika Sarkar, etc. And so what it does kind of open up is the necessity to decenter, even as you are critically looking at the author in terms of many of his or her pronouncements. And that decentering is also an act of intervening within the author's oeuvre. So that when Habermas is taking on the public sphere, there are certain things, I think, which can be extracted from there. Just as Marx was an Orientalist, but there are certain things that could be extracted from Marx, or could be extracted from Dewey, as Ambedkar had done. So that kind of extraction, without becoming beholden to the notion of the author as everything, as authority itself, is I think very important move that one needs to make, especially when one lives in the post-colony, where it becomes then, what do we say then? Because if we exorcise our colonial past, and how do we speak then? I'm speaking in English. Hindi, can I speak? Bengali, can I speak? It's all been inflected by colonialism and education system. I can only speak maybe in Tamil, or in maybe Malayalam to some extent, or Tamil would be but that's no speech. So that's number one. And primitive accumulation, of course, is a much larger issue than just bulldozers going and grabbing and evicting people. I mean, there's a whole conceptual idea of primitive accumulation, and Kalyan Sanyal has a kind of idea that it repeats itself over time. And I won't go into the details to that. And the idea of ideology is very much also present in structural transformation. Actually, it does talk about ideology, but also inflects ideology in terms of what it can also allow you to do in as against its basic kind of premise. So ideology again is not a totality. Ideology also field of contestation, as Gramsci, for instance, and that is itself something separate from, say, the political economy. I mean, it is linked to it, but when you're talking of ideology as contestation, then you're taking up also a particular background understanding of political economy, as I think all of us are in a certain sense. But it's also necessary to speak of ideology as such. And what are the specific contestation, what are the specific mechanisms through which that's going? Sorry, I'm taking too long.
I think you kind of answered both the questions. So I will just say one sentence for each. One is that the first question, it is true that writers are thinking about the world they inhabit. And that was a word which dominated by capital and so on. I think decentering the author is very important, but one must add, in addition to it, one might also think in terms of the fact that while he's thinking about capitalism, one kind of journey of capitalism, is there some core of capitalism which we don't find present here? So are those relations of exchange and all that he's writing about, that is also to be seen. So there are levels of differences, and there are levels in which maybe the colonial past is connected us also. And the fact that we are thinking of a political economic system which prevails in more than one place makes us suggest that we may have resources, some ideas, some concept which we can perhaps think about in our own context, not necessarily in it. Your question is, in some sense, your question has answered his, because you are saying that there is the primacy or the similarity of the political economy framework, and that if we center it, you find Habermas relevant here. And the other element is, I think you mentioned already, that ideology has to be unpacked separately in and by itself, so that you have to think in terms of the kind of language, rhetoric, what kind of moralities, contradictions, social contradictions will pick up. They are not determined entirely by them. So they do have a space for people.
Okay, I'll respond to the first question because it's important. This whole problem of Europe, actually Europe is an elephant in the room. It's always very difficult to talk about Europe. And I think the thing about Habermas is that there's a certain kind of insularity, a certain way of looking at the world from a wholly European, German, continental perspective. And then there are these attempts to incorporate a certain Anglo-American theorization. So the engagement with John Rawls, for example, and an almost admirable engagement with Rawls. But I think from the part of the world that we are in, I would have always been against decoloniality. I think it's a pretty bad idea because it ultimately flows into a kind of a endorsement of Dutta authoritarianism. I keep citing the example of Walter Vignolos, the high priest of decolonial theory, endorsing a book like J.S. Buck's India that that's the danger. But on the question of Europe, I think the perspective that we should be adopting is the title of Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, Provincializing Europe, not in the way that Dipesh suggests we should. But I think what we are witnessing right now is actually a geopolitical provincializing of Europe. The fact that NATO is in crisis. I mean, never in my lifetime I think that the Americans would walk out of NATO. Right? And we are witnessing that. So, in a way, whenever I look at the map, and I'm also fascinated by maps, I've been fascinated by Europe as a continent, the idea of Europe, because it has exercised a certain kind of imagination on us. But I we are looking at a particular geopolitical process whereby Europe, which is, when you think of it in terms of the much larger Eurasian landmass, is just a poor peninsula. And we are witnessing that in terms of the fact that it's been ditched by the Americans, and the Russians have always loomed, and the Russian winters have always been Europe's failing, whether it is Napoleon 1812, or more recently Ukraine crisis, gas prices going up. So it is in that sense putting Europe in its place. But putting Europe in its place does not mean jettisoning the legacy of the Enlightenment. I mean, again, I am with Habermas on that. I am very much with Habermas on the idea that the Enlightenment as a project, modernity, it's an unfinished project. And we have to accept these as significant intellectual landmarks as we move forward in the forging of the 21st century. I'll make one more quick point that suddenly crossed my mind, which is that he's a very cautious, over-cautious thinker. And it's almost as if he wants to hold on to something, I'm talking about Habermas, and if that thing is lost, everything is lost. Now, in certain moments in history, I think we are living through one of those moments. We are at one of those very significant moments where a lot of the past has to be left behind. There is a future that we are waiting. We have to kind of be brave enough to think about what the future will look like. And I always quote this remarkable woman, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Motley. And she makes this point remarkably, very eloquently. She says that the very same people who created the rules-based international order after 1945 are the ones who tear it up right now. And as for smaller nations like them, we're not a small nation, but we are insignificant in terms of the economic might and heft that the West has. It's important to pick up these torn pieces, these fragments, and to kind of carry them forward and to build something anew. Now that's something that Habermas lacks, the ability to boldly envision what a future will look like, because he's so perhaps traumatized by his experience and the childhood that he in Germany. So that's, I think, where he may have gone wrong.
Well, he could have been traumatized by the future, which we all are.
That's another trauma.
Climate change, Gaza, whatever you want.
So as we come to end this discussion, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our speakers, Professor Dutta, Professor Mahajan, and Dr. Amir Ali for their insightful lectures. And thank you audience for their participation and engagement. Thank you everyone for being here.